want to welcome everybody and thank you for attending Hawthorn University's webinar series. I'm Paula Bartholomew, the Director of Online Events, and I'm always pleased to be able to be here together and facilitate these presentations. And I want to let you know we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So just please, anytime during the webinar, just write your questions or your comments into the question panel so you're in queue and I'll be ready. And I certainly expect some terrific information here today, and this presentation is being recorded and it'll be available for replay on our website in just a few days. And I really am pleased to announce that Hawthorn University has been accredited by the Distance Education Accrediting Commission, that's the DEAC. And you know, this is really an important milestone in the continuing growth and success for Hawthorn, and of course we're just really happy to be able to share it with you, and I certainly welcome you to share it with others too. Spread the banners, shout it loud, we're excited here. And you know, if you're listening for the first time, I see a number of new people on the call now. I want to let you know that Hawthorn University's Holistic Health and Webinar series is a platform that brings excellent information and resources for our students, alumni, and faculty in order to augment their Hawthorn education and expose us to a wealth of knowledge and experience that our guest presenters bring to the table again and again. You know, the many ways that our students and grads are using their Hawthorn education and their practices is nothing short of amazing to me. We have a variety of accredited degree and certificate programs at Hawthorn. Some of them are for people that are pursuing a clinical track with the goal of working directly with their clients. And then we have other programs that are dedicated to those that are seeking to primarily educate, whether that's write books or develop courses, workshops, programs, do public speaking, teach for schools. And then we have other options for individuals who simply want to learn valuable, credible information in a conducive environment. The success of our students is the testament of Hawthorn's mission and principles to provide quality and really affordable holistic health and nutrition education. Our webinars are open to the interested public too, because heck, we just love learning more at Hawthorn. All right, that brings me to today's webinar, and the fact that awareness of the health-supported practice of fermentation is growing. So I feel really fortunate that we have Dr. Sarica Cernohous returning to teach us how to incorporate them with her presentation, Kitchen Alchemy, the research supporting the power of traditional food preparation. So today we get to learn about the basic and traditional food preparation practices that have been a cornerstone to human development and why we want to bring them back into our kitchens for best health. I just certainly think this presentation provides another bonus for our professional toolkits for sure. And if you've not met Dr. Sarica, let me give you a little bit of background. She's a practitioner of acupuncture and Chinese methods using the Japanese style methods of acupuncture and Chinese medicine. She does LED light therapy and herbal medicine in her private practice, and she's an active board member for the National Association of Nutrition Professionals, the NANP. She's the author of The Importance and Practical Application of Traditional Food Preparation Techniques for the book, The Funky Kitchen, and its accompanying online course, Fresh, Fun, and Flavorful in the Funky Kitchen. She's also a coach for Metabolic Balance of Germany. She's crafted a personalized weight optimization and lifestyle program for them, and it's called the Lapis Method. And since 2011, Sarica's been sharing recipes and health articles on her website, naturallivingtoday.com. All right, it's such a pleasure to have you back with us, Sarica. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. It's a joy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you today. And as Paula was saying, I've been, at this practice of working with traditional food preparation, specifically through the vehicle of the Funky Kitchen and the teachings around that for some time. And today, what I'm going to be sharing with you is kind of a circle back around that I've done, where when I first wrote the Funky Kitchen, it was based off of much of the research of Dr. Weston A. Price and the techniques of traditional food preparation that he helped to uncover and bring to the modern setting as it was in the early 20th century. And then I coupled that with food science and just a basic understanding of what these techniques should be doing in the kitchen lab setting. But at the time, the research supporting these practices was not nearly as robust as it is now. I've been blessed that my sister is a chef, and so when I would have questions related to food science, Amy and I could work through that together. And again, I could just understand from a chemistry perspective what was happening. And so it's really so exciting to me now to, you know, these number of years later, have this information, and I'm able to share that with you. And really what this comes down to is a lot of tinkering. This is tinkering in the kitchen so that we can, you know, make a significant inroad into the bioavailability of food and just making it a more vibrant experience for us. So let's go ahead and step right in. So what constitutes traditional food preparation? Ancestral practices would certainly fall under that. And surprisingly, you know, even canning is kind of new on the scene. So what we're looking at with ancestral practices is a lot of times really leaning on beneficial bacteria as a preservation method, as well as working with broths for full extraction of nutrition from the foods that, you know, are being used in that broth. So these are sorts of ancestral practices that really allowed for a lack of reliance on modern tools and technology, you know, things like refrigerators and preservatives, things like that. So really taking it back to very simple practices that are incredibly powerful. Methods that create an ease around digestion, and actual ease in time of preparation. That's also a really important component. And then the nutrient density that I know so many of us in the health field are aware of, but it is something that begs, you know, stating here that good animal husbandry practices, healthy soil, you know, the terroir of the land is what we're really looking at here to bring out the best of the foods that we are ingesting. And so much of this is because I think many of us recognize that, of course, all diseases do begin in the gut, as Hippocrates is quoted as saying. And so these are the things that we do want to be mindful of, and I know that many of us are, but the research is really bearing out that, in fact, this is the case, that all diseases do begin in the gut. And there we go. Alrighty, so dysbiosis is one of the ways that that does show up as being problematic, chronic inflammation at the level of the gut. I've certainly worked arm in arm with practitioners through the years who've made the statement that, you know, it's not a matter of if we have leaky gut, it's just a matter of the degree of severity. And with this presentation, you know, there's a domination of cellular metabolism. You know, this free radical damage lends itself toward the aging process, the disease processes. And of course, this takes the lion's share of ATP, mitochondrial energy. And, you know, we know some of the heavy hitters that have impact here. And, you know, so many of us that are even in the health field. You know, it's not that we necessarily came to the work that we do because we were raised in this utopian experience of perfect health. Many of us came to being natural health care practitioners and coaches by way of our own health struggles. And so, you know, what we see here in terms of these stresses that are put on the human body are really items that many of us probably have experienced in our own lives. And there is so much research. These are the things I'm going to be talking about today. Today's presentation is really about showing you why this all matters, how powerful this can be. But as you can see here in this short list of, you know, just a few studies, I mean, we're talking about epithelial barrier integrity to modulating gene expression, inhibiting pathogen virulence, factor expressions. There are so many ways that diet impacts the microbiome and in turn our wellness presentation. And when I was really going through all of the research, I really started doing this about a year ago. One of the things that touched me deeply and continues to is the amount of mental anguish that we seem to be experiencing as a society. And the psychobiome is what I'm talking about here in terms of marrying the impact of nutrition and what's going on in our gut to what's happening in our mental, emotional expression. And we can see here, you know, Journal of Physiological Anthropology, 2014, you know, dietary items have such a huge part to play in mitigating inflammation, oxidative stress, and of course, you know, what we're talking about here today, this is largely impacted by the microbiota. And we can see how that can be, you know, this is a close-up here of the enteric nervous system, and we can see, you know, the small arterioles and the small venules that go to and fro from the digestive tract back up through the system to the brain, and this constant communication that is happening between what's going on in our belly and what is going on in our mental and emotional expression. Again, here's another shot, of course, looking at you know, afferent and efferent behavior between the microbiome and this axis that happens with the gut and brain. It is a very intricately connected entity. And, you know, again, the research is supporting that, you know, gosh, one of the things that really does seem to make an impact here is probiotic-rich food. Again, looking at the impact on mood, probiotic bacteria, you know, in lab chow with rat mammals can increase peripheral tryptophan levels, alter dopamine and serotonin turnover in the frontal cortex and limbic system, and increase the tissue levels of omega-3 fatty acids. And in turn, all of this has a huge impact in mental distress in human beings. I have to say, the author, the main organizer of this research, the last name there, I believe it's pronounced Cernohous. Her first name is Eva. And some other reading that I've been doing lately is on the impact of forest bathing. It's a very, it's a practice that is happening in Japan, and it's getting yourself out into nature. This is also a big part of what I definitely direct my patients to do. And it is the same author who, and she's an MD actually, who is doing a tremendous lot of research behind the impact of traditional food preparation methods, as well as looking at the impact of getting the body out into the forest and other natural settings. So I encourage you to check out some of the research and her website. Really great stuff. Here she's talking about, you know, what the research has revealed in regard to gut inflammation, and lipopolysaccharides are an endotoxin that are generated in large part by the modern Western diet. And so what the research reveals is that traditional dietary practices, like what we're going to be talking about today, these gut inflammatory components are largely reduced when someone is consuming a more traditional diet. Again, using things like culturing and broths and properly prepared foods so that we remove anti-nutrients. What has been found is a marked increase in LPS elevations. And this has quite an impact, again, on the central neurotransmitters of the body, and has the very similar impact to reduce this LPS load as using antidepressant medications. And so, you know, oftentimes we talk about the impact on serotonin, dopamine, related to the healthy microbiome. But here's another discussion looking at another component of these lipopolysaccharide endotoxins. So there are a lot of ways that we can either, find happiness or discord, based off of our food choices. Fermentation is an incredible method for really tinkering and changing the quality and the bioavailability of different components of whole foods, B vitamins, magnesium, zinc. Vitamin D levels can be influenced, by a healthy microbiota. Also vitamin C. I'm sure you've probably heard of Captain Cook's, the sailor Captain Cook. These men would be on these ships and traveling for months, even years at times, but with long months before they would hit land again. And so again, before the age of refrigeration. And so taking fresh food on these voyages was something that, the fresh food would be gone in no time. And Captain Cook noticed that he was losing a lot of his men to a very debilitating and horrible way to die, which is scurvy. And over time of tinkering with the foods that were brought onto the ships, it was revealed that using fermented cabbage in the format, of course, of sauerkraut was truly a lifesaver for the seamen on these long voyages. And we understand now that so much of that is because the vitamin C quantity is magnified in the naturally occurring cabbage. So when it goes through a fermentation process, not only is it preserved and able to be used, but we actually increase the amount of vitamin C that's available, in turn preventing scurvy. And boy, when it comes to fermentation, let us count the ways. There are so many ways that we can bring fermentation into and onto foods, bringing it into our diet. Fermentation can happen on everything from a piece of cabbage to a little bit of sugar, to cow's milk, to actual meat. There are so many ways that fermentation can happen. So I really love this slide for showing us all the different factors and in turn what comes from those factors by way of fermentation. And what you see here over on the right, I know that looks probably like Himalayan salt crystals, but actually it's my favorite fermentation media. It's the crystals of water kefir. And in the Funky Kitchen, I use water kefir as my fermentation starter for everything because it's easy to maintain. So fermented foods are also, not surprisingly, a really terrific way to help recover from that boy in the bubble syndrome that we have found ourselves in, these hyper clean environments, with antibacterial everything. The ingestion of fermented foods can increase by up to 10,000 plus fold the amount of microbes in the diet. And one of the things that I love about fermented foods, as opposed to just taking a probiotic capsule, is that you are getting such a broad spectrum of different ferments. Now, of course, that's also a difficult thing to control. We can look at a given food and say, generally, in most circumstances, these would be the strains that would be in that food. But, based off of a person's kitchen, what naturally occurring microbes are there, or on the vegetables or whatever other food is being fermented, that's going to impart its own bacterial profile. But my gosh, what an incredible way to bring in nutrition and a wide variety of beneficial bacteria and beneficial yeasts as well, and do it in a way that's relatively inexpensive for the patient. So it's just great stuff. And today what I'm going to be talking about, in my mind, are some of the kind of more hot button types of foods. I think when a lot of people think of ferments, they might think of kombucha, or they might think of sauerkraut, and those are wonderful. But I wanted to focus today also on some of the foods that are often maligned. you know, when we're talking about best ways to eat, and one of those is dairy. I know a lot of people say you need to steer clear of dairy, but I just want to point out a few things about that. One of the biggest issues, of course, with consuming dairy is the lactose, the milk sugar. And through the fermentation process, the beneficial bacteria and, you know, beneficial yeast that may be there, they actually use that lactose as a fuel source. It's converted. And so that's why people will say, well, I can't drink milk and I really don't do well with ice cream, but I seem to do okay with cheese, or I seem to do okay with yogurt. This is why. Or it could be why, I should say, because one of the other big issues that is in milk products is the casein, the milk portion. And again, this is also broken down in many of the fermentation processes. And so what we're doing is we're allowing these microbes to work on our behalf. The way I have always envisioned this is the microbes are kind of akin to taking the activity of our digestive tract and putting it onto the kitchen counter and allowing all that to happen on the kitchen counter. And then by the time we put it into our mouths, it is in a format that is much easier for us to put to use. And of course, you know, all the exciting ways that flavor profiles change depending on, you know, which culture starters we're using, that sort of thing. And there are some really great benefits to consuming fermented dairy products: healthy weight management, reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease, reduction in risk of type 2 diabetes, reduction in risks leading to overall mortality, improved glucose metabolism, reduction in muscle soreness following resistance exercise, and improved lactose digestion. And that's a really interesting thing. That's very similar to what we see with milk kefir. Milk kefir is another fermented dairy product, and that was one of the early researched foods that, you know, in this kind of pharmacopoeia, if you will, of traditional food preparation. And what was found in this early research was that people who were lactose intolerant, when they would consume milk that had been converted to milk kefir, that actually their lower bowel became implanted with the bacteria that helped them to convert milk. So it made them tolerant to being able to consume milk. And we see something very similar here happening with yogurt. I often think of it as like a pool party. You know, when you're having fun in that pool, you're calling your friends in with you. And I see that happening when people begin incorporating more traditional foods into their diet and bringing in, you know, this wide variety of microbes. They often call for one another. So it's pretty amazing. But I want to also look beyond yogurt because I think many of us do think of yogurt if we're thinking of fermented dairy. You know, and I want to share why it's better than just, you know, helping somebody to recover from, you know, taking a round of antibiotics or something. There are different things that happen with fermentation of dairy. There's either a release, a synthesis, or an enrichment of these different components. Lactoferrin, which enhances immunity, improves digestion. As mentioned earlier around the vitamin C with cabbage, something similar happens with the micronutrients and minerals that are in the cow's milk or goat's milk, sheep's milk, camel's milk. Conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, boy, that sure is some nifty stuff. It, you know, has been shown through research to have quite an impact on weight optimization, helping the immunity, getting healthy cholesterol levels, and all of that's enriched. That activity of the conjugated linoleic acid is enriched by the lactobacilli that are in these wonderful fermented products. Sphingolipids, these are bioactive lipids that are crucial to cell signaling pathways, and so that's very important for nervous system health. Exopolysaccharides, boy, crazy stuff there. They are considered the source of anti-tumor, anti-ulcer, immunomodulation. That's where we find, you know, this activity in probiotic foods, very powerful. And bioactive peptides, anti-hypertensive action, antimicrobial, antioxidative, immune modulatory. opioid and mineral binding properties. And so there's this calming effect, you know, that, I mean, when we look at what that is there, it's like reducing inflammation, it's reducing pathogenic load, and it's giving a calming effect to the system. And so, you know, who thinks about that when they're having some yogurt? And so I want you to think about that. You know, these are the nifty things that we can share with our patients and our clients. And so, yes, as I'd mentioned earlier, milk kefir. So these milk proteins, you know, when we're talking about macronutrients, of course, we're talking about either fat or protein or carbohydrate. And milk proteins are extensively broken down in the fermentation process using kefir granules, generating on average about 609 peptides that are unique to kefir, and changing more than 1,500 peptides. I mean, when I say alchemy, I'm not kidding. This is kitchen alchemy. This is turning your kitchen into a lab. And if you're not so inclined, I mean, you know, then you can, it's a wonderful thing. We can buy these types of foods at the grocery stores now. And antimicrobial, antihypertensive, and again, immunomodulatory functions. And it's through this, you know, beautiful transformation that happens. And again, you know, circling back around to the impact of what this means in terms of global happiness is really an important consideration. But there was some research that showed that just 1 month of consumption of fermented dairy, you know, containing these strains here, can have a positive influence on brain activity versus the baseline. You know, central processing of emotions and sensation. These are really capable of having beneficial impact on the central nervous system function. But maybe you just want to eat fermented veggies and you really want to steer clear of dairy for whatever reasons. You know, fermented vegetables are another fantastic way to work with naturally bringing these microbes into the diet. These are, of course, some different examples here. Traditional condiments, you know, ketchup and mustard, again, these would be oftentimes fermented. And what the lactobacilli, that's this reference that you keep seeing there, the lab, they enhance the conversion of phenolic compounds, some of which strongly activate NRF2. I'm sure many of us have heard of NRF2. There's a very popular product that is based on, you know, activating NRF2. Well, here it is right here in fermented vegetables. This is central to detoxification and antioxidant mechanisms in the body. And boy, you can get it nice and cheap with a little sauerkraut or some kimchi. And so, like I say, today I wanted to not, as you see, that was a brief little statement there about sauerkraut and fermented vegetables, because I think most people feel pretty good about using that. But I want to focus today on kind of the hairy ones, you know, where people say, oh, gosh, you know, I thought we weren't supposed to eat that. And grains have become another of these foods that I think have been quite maligned. And given the way that most of us have been raised around grains, whether it's, you know, Wonder Bread, you know, I think that a lot of my friends had Wonder Bread. We have a slightly healthier version. You know, I think it just had some molasses food coloring in it. And that was our wheat bread when I was growing up. There are so many ways that we have not taken care of this seed food. And I just have to say, one of the things that I think is very interesting is that in different dietary movements that we do see, for instance, like the paleo movement, people are not consuming much in the way of grains. And grains are a seed, as are beans. And so, you know, if you think of what a bean is, a bean comes inside a pod. And that pod is nothing more than a seed carrier. And so they're very much similar. Likewise, when we talk about actual seeds and nuts, it is very much the same thing. And so when you stand back and look at it this way, it's an interesting discussion point, I think, of why it is that there has been such hubbub around the consumption of grains and oftentimes steering into legumes and beans. But boy, people are going crazy eating nuts and seeds and nut butters and flours made with nuts and seeds, that sort of thing. And really, they're very similar in many ways in their composition. And again, I just want to frame it that they really are all just seeds. The whole idea is that they are to propagate the same species of plant over and over again. So we're talking about one type of seed this way, which is grains. Beneficial components in whole grains. They're a great source of a variety of B vitamins, of vitamin E, essential fatty acids, macro and trace minerals. They're also a good source of protein, depending on the type of grain and the different amino acid content that it has, and also, of course, a good source of fiber. But there are challenging components in grains, and I want to, again, put parenthetically, any seeds, and what we find, phytic acid, enzyme inhibitors. Fiber can be a problem for some people. Rancid essential fatty acids, that's really a big player. When we are talking about the exposure to light and to oxygen of these different seed foods that are rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are very prone to oxidation, rancid essential fatty acids are a really big player. And despite how powerful fermentation can be on different components of nutrients in these whole foods, if the essential fatty acids have gone rancid, the action of fermentation is not going to be able to reverse that. But boy, I tell you, it's amazing how fermentation can do what I consider to be almost like creating a zombie. You can take something that is really inert in so many ways. I remember reading a study where someone was working in a food bank, and they wanted to increase the nutrient capacity of the foods that were available to the people of the food bank. And so much of what was available was canned foods. And so this group, they took, I think it was canned asparagus, and they fermented it. So they opened up the can and they cultured it. They used some kind of ferment starter. And what ends up happening is you take a food that is completely enzymatically dead, so devoid of vibrant life. And through the fermentation process, you bring it new life. You make it enzymatically active. You have these changes that happen in relation to B vitamins, to vitamin C, to mineral bioavailability. So those are the kind of amazing things that can happen. But when it comes to rancidity, that is something that cannot be reversed, unfortunately. Also, altered proteins. This is a big one too. I was a teenager in the late 80s, and at that time, everything was all about the non-fat movement. And I remember thinking that I was doing myself some great favor by eating rice cakes. And rice cakes, I don't think many of us would necessarily, go reaching for a rice cake in 2019. But at the time, they were considered this non-fat health food. And one of the things that I did not consider at that time, which I certainly consider now, though, is the protein alteration that happens with high heat and high pressure. So when you take that grain of rice and you subject it to super high heat and super high pressure and cause it to actually puff up like that, that is something that does a lot of damage to the inherent protein structure of that grain. And we see that with puffed rice cereals, with extruded cereals, even things that look like they could be, a healthier version, like maybe a shredded wheat. That's an extrusion process, which is a very high heat, high temperature, and very degrading to the protein structure. And then, of course, when we have our gluten-bearing grains, that is a concern as well. And of course, gluten is something that I think everybody has on their radar screen, but I want to talk about that a little bit today. So let's chat for a second about some of these anti-nutrients, again, that are common to these seed foods. The first one is lectins. Now, these are carbohydrate-binding proteins, and they're similar to antibodies in their ability to bind to our red blood cells. They're associated with nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting. They bind to the epithelial wall of the gut. And so you can see where this sounds an awful lot like the issues people have with gluten. And so this might be why sometimes if someone says, oh, I'm on a gluten-free diet, but they're eating a diet that is still rich in lectins, they may still be having a lot of gut issues. So it is something to keep on your radar screen. It's associated with food allergies and nutritional deficiencies for the reasons that are listed above there. High lectin foods, legumes, cereal grains, nuts, seeds, potatoes, and nightshades. And so they are something that can be quite problematic. In fact, Dr. Stephen Gundry out of your diet. Peeling the veggies, shoot for fruits that are in season. More lectins are created by the plant if it is not in season. So that is something to keep in mind. And this is where I start just saying, gosh dang it, now we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. This is actually on his Amazon page for his book, Swap Out Your Brown Rice for White. Whole grains and seeds with hard outer coatings are designed by nature to cause digestive distress and are full of lectins. Well, the issue with that is that there's also a lot of potential good nutrition in that bran portion that is being polished off when we swap our brown rice for white. So one of the things that I want to point out, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate for you here today, is looking at what we're missing out on when we throw that baby out with the bathwater. You know, we have to remember that we have evolved with these foods, you know, for a long, long time. And there may be that over time, there was something that in our epigenetic expression, we began to have good benefit by having a little bit of these components in our diet. I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know how this can be that something can cut both ways the way that it does. But this is one of the research items related to lectins as anti-cancer agents. And when we look here, there are a number of different ways that lectins actually can have impact in a positive way against cancer. And so again, this whole idea of the baby out with the bathwater, it can be too extreme. And so my proposition is, let's just reduce them in our diet. Let's do what we can do to degrade the content of them, to make it so that, you know, maybe we're getting a little bit in our diet, but not a lot. And the ways that that has happened in terms of traditional food preparation is by soaking and fermentation. And by nature, if you're fermenting a grain, nut, seed, or bean, you are going to be soaking that because it's going to be in a watery substance to make that happen. So that has been shown through research to cause a degradation, these two practices, soaking and fermentation. But additionally, pressure cooking, and I'm not talking about the pressure cooking of extrusion, like we were saying with the rice cakes. I'm talking pressure cooking that would happen maybe in an instant pot, to that level, which is really just a few degrees above the normal boiling point and just a little bit more pressure than would be naturally occurring. So it's very different than the extrusion process. Again, the removal of the hull, that's the sort of thing that Dr. Gundry is talking about of, you know, just eat your white rice and not your brown. Beyond the cancer issue that I just raised, you know, I'd mentioned the essential fatty acids, the fiber. These are really powerful components that are found in that hull. So now we move on to gluten, another anti-nutrient. And this is a heavy hitter. And people, this is a big issue for a lot of people, whether they have been proven to have celiac disease or if, you know, they just notice that they have a gluten sensitivity. But it is it is a very intense subject for a lot of people. And so a lot of people just flat out avoid foods that contain gluten. And I'm, you know, free will, do what you need to do there. But I want to talk about how it is that gluten is impacted by some of the methods that we're talking about here today. But before we do that, let's give a definition of what gluten is. It's a composite of storage proteins termed prolamins and glutellins, and they're stored together in the starch in the endosperm of different cereal grains. So, you know, it's wheat, barley, rye, oats, emmer, spelt, einkorn, kamut. These are all gluten-bearing grains. And so that would be the related species and hybrids. And oats only if they've been processed in a facility that processes other gluten-bearing foods. So what happens here through fermentation is a very interesting thing. And back when I was understanding this from just a food science perspective of what it is that acidification and the activity of these bacteria in yeast do, if given enough time, that should take these larger macronutrient components and degrade them into peptides and into amino acids. And lo and behold, happy to see that there actually has been some research around this over the years that reveals that what I was, you know, thinking was correct in terms of the processes happening does in fact appear to be the case. Where we have these significant changes that happen through, you know, the protein breakdown, the activation of enzymes, this acidification that happens during a long sourdough fermentation carried out by the lactic acid, the lab, and yeast. And this positively affects the overall quality of the baked goods. You know, it's a better flavor profile. I mean, who enjoys eating gluten-free bread? I know I don't enjoy that. In particular, the hydrolysis of native proteins of the cereal flours may improve the functional features of baked goods. The wheat flour, so wheat flour processed with fungal proteases and selected lactic acid bacteria was demonstrated to be safe, not for someone who's gluten intolerant, but for celiac patients. That is quite a statement there. And so you know, if this piques your interest, I encourage you to, I have all my references at the end of this presentation, but you could probably just Google these folks' names, that date and gluten, and find the research that supports that. Here's another. Sourdough bread made from wheat and non-toxic flours and started with selected lactobacilli is tolerated by celiac sprue patients. This is from 2004. So this, you know, this goes back quite a ways. And this is only, in my mind, that's not very long, 24 hours of fermentation. The wheat gliadins and low molecular mass polypeptides were hydrolyzed almost totally. This shows that bread biotechnology that uses selected lactobacilli, non-toxic flours, and a long fermentation time is a novel tool for decreasing the level of gluten intolerance in humans. So I just want to broaden the discussion that gluten-free isn't necessarily the only answer if a person is wishing to reduce or do away with the gluten in their diet. The authors that you saw in the first slide about gluten there, I believe they're Italian, and I believe they have come up with a product line in Italy that uses these methods for making wheat-based products that are designed to be safe for people who have this gluten sensitivity. So pretty exciting stuff. I don't know that that's available here in the States yet. Another anti-nutrient is phytates, and what this is a phosphorus storage in a seed, and in sprouting it's degraded and used to propagate the new plant. It impairs absorption of zinc and iron, and it has a lesser impact on calcium, and this is really important in our clients that are vegetarian and vegan. You know, these are people who are not going to be getting maybe additional iron in their diet from eating, you know, muscle cuts of meat, that sort of thing. Phytates are found only in plants, again, nuts, grains, seeds, and legumes, so the seed plants. So they sound like they could be problematic, and in some respects they are, but there's also a component of them that is healthy for us. Again, related to cancer. So I just find that very interesting that this maligned part of a maligned group of foods oftentimes actually appears to have quite a positive impact in cancer cell differentiation, and even getting the behavior of cancer cells to revert back to behaving more like normal cells. Other benefits of phytates are antioxidant action and reduction in stone formation, which makes sense because of their impact on mineral absorption in the body. So again, it's not that we want, in my mind, I don't think we want to try and totally avoid phytates. I don't really think that's possible, but we do want to do what we can to reduce them, again, especially for vegetarian and vegan clients. And the research supports that soaking, sprouting, and fermentation are fantastic ways to reduce the phytate content in foods. So this proper preparation of seed foods, you know, we talked about kind of those 4 groups, imitates the natural factors that would neutralize the seed's natural preservatives and allow it to sprout and begin the pre-digestion of fermentation. So we want to kind of treat these foods like if we were going to be growing them into a new plant. We want to provide moisture. We want to have a little bit of warmth. You know, it can't be too cold because, you know, we've got some enzymatic activity that's going to be starting here. We want a little bit of slight acidity. That is one of the things that happens as we begin to go through the fermentation process, and the carbohydrates are converted by the lactobacilli and the yeast. And we have to give it time. We can't rush this. I remember my husband, all of a sudden one day we had like 6 kids staying over at the house. And while I make our bread from scratch, and I wanted to make French toast for the kids, I did not have enough bread. And it takes about a day and a half for the start of the bread to the finish. And so I said, please go to Whole Foods and pick me up a bag of organic sourdough bread. And so he comes home, and I immediately, of course, turn over the bag and look at the label. And it was organic enriched wheat flour that had apple cider vinegar added to it to give it a sour flavor. Now, I have no idea how long that apple cider vinegar sat with the flour before they baked it, but what they were trying to do there was create in fast fashion the flavor of sourdough without actually activating all the amazing qualities that happen through a real sourdough process, which I hope you're understanding a little bit here, even with just those 2 slides about gluten. So sometimes we just do the best we can with, you know, what's available to us at the store, but my gosh, it does make a difference to get into the habit of doing these things. I mean, golly gee, look at this woman down here. This woman over here is from a Swiss village. This photograph was from some of Dr. Weston A. Price's research. And she is holding there a magnificent loaf of long fermented rice sourdough bread, which they would make once a year in their village. So let's just have a quick look at what these nutritional benefits of souring flour for bread, both gluten and gluten-free breads, because this means a lot too, even to gluten-free breads. I mean, you heard me talk about the impact of lectins and how they behave a lot like gluten. And so souring the grains, even if we're going to make a gluten-free bread, really matters. Lactic acid increases the levels of bioactive compounds, the phenolics, causes a degradation of phytate, as we've mentioned, which in turn increases mineral bioavailability. It enhances the solubility of magnesium and phosphorus, and, you know, for the reasons that we just talked about, you know, especially related to phytates. It reduces the overall starch bioavailability. That's a really big one, because that's going to have an impact on glucose, isn't it? And that in turn has going to play out in improved postprandial glycemic response. Again, I hope that makes sense, you know, given what we're talking about here. It's shown to be a protective factor for beta-glucan in breads, and that beta-glucan is really powerful. Again, the research around it supporting antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer properties. And the lactobacilli may also produce bioactive compounds such as peptides and amino acid derivatives, such as butyric acid, that have different functionalities and potentially prebiotic exopolysaccharides. And so this is one of the nifty things too, is that we're talking here about the food source for the beneficial bacteria, the prebiotic. That's going to be there in these properly prepared grains. And so really, I hope you're seeing that this can actually be an incredible nutritional consideration. So the effect of fermentation on Brans of grains and legumes, beneficial immune, glycemic, and anti-inflammatory activities. So these are, you know, and this goes beyond just making bread. This is, you know, getting into looking at, you know, the beans and all the different types of grains. And a little bit more research of fermented grain and physiological effect. Improved handling of stress and fatigue when consuming fermented rice bran, increases the available GABA content. Boy, talk about a calmer to the brain, significantly in fermented grains and beans. And fermented polyphenols enhance microbiome activity and beneficial species propagation in the human gut. So not only benefiting us by giving us the prebiotics, but also even giving the nutrition, the energy to the cells of the gut itself. So they really can be a powerful adjunct to the diet. And then finally, you know, we've talked a lot about fermentation. I just want to touch for a moment on broth. I feel like broth is one of those food trends that we've all seen happen, and folks have treated broth. I think folks got maybe a little more excited about it than maybe was warranted for the claims that were being made. That being said, I think broth is one of the most calming foods to our human experience. It is something that can have such an incredible grounding quality. And so I do want to say this about it. Of course, what a broth does is it allows for the use of kind of the cast off parts, you know, the bones and joints, the skin, things that I know I'm not inclined to want to chew on. And quite honestly, when it comes to bones and joints and stuff like that, I don't even have the dentition for it. You don't either. These are things that when we put them into the media of, you know, a hot liquid, it allows an extraction of many of the components that make up those very, very viable parts that help to build who we are. That's pretty powerful stuff. It's a moderate source of bioavailable mineral content. So this is kind of one of the caveats that I wanted to bring up. You know, people say, oh my gosh, it's such a great, you know, source of minerals. Not so much. So I do want to keep that in check. And it may be a rich source of fatty acids, depending on how much fat made its way into the liquid to create the broth. And depending on the amount and cut of joint tissue, it may also be a significant source of collagen peptides and GAGs, the glycosaminoglycans. That's this kind of sticky protein structure that really has such a great impact on our skin health and our joint health. In Chinese medicine, you know, we talk about if something is ailing you, then you should eat that because the nutrients are going to be there that way. And so using the bones and the joints and getting that nutrition into a broth is a great way to give your body those building blocks. And of course, by the time it enters your system, your body's going to allocate those resources where it needs to. But it's nice to just give it the parts that it needs and let it do what it needs to do. So of course, the traditional uses of broth, it's a tremendous food for convalescence. If I had $1 for every time someone, you know, had some kind of oral surgery or had a baby, you know, things that are really, you know, very traumatic potentially and debilitating, and I said, okay, broth needs to be in your diet, you know, that I'd be wealthy. It's a tonifier. We use that term in Chinese medicine following surgery, injury, or birth. It benefits the gut. It benefits the joints and skin. It supports immune function. And these are the ways that it has been used traditionally. But we see now that the modern research actually supports some of this. Chicken soup inhibits the neutrophil migration in relation to the common cold. Gelatin-rich broth is, of course, a great source of collagen, peptides, and amino acids. You know, I talked about the GAGs. Glycine, an amino acid, is a large component of collagen, and that's, a lot of people think of glycine and its role for liver function, but it's also really important for neurotransmitter signaling. Proline, another amino acid, structural integrity, again, related to neurotransmitters and also structural integrity of the skeleton. Glutamine is an important amino acid, an energy source for the intestinal epithelial cells and activated immune cells. And it is a rich source of these lesser minerals. So not as much calcium, not as much magnesium, but more of these kind of trace minerals. And again, depending on what else goes into that broth, that's going to have an impact, because most people are going to be putting veggies into their broth as well. So, you know, these are the nuances that are going to be unique to what each person does in their own kitchen. And so bringing it all together, I know we talked about a lot today. If you want to do this, I would suggest starting, you know, use these methods. I would suggest starting with one method or technique, get comfortable with it, and learn from there. I always say don't go for perfection. You know, Rome was not built in a day. I think it's really important to purchase. We live in a time now where so many of these foods are available commercially, and it can, if it's new to you or to your patients or clients, it allows you to have kind of a frame of reference of like, what should I be looking for here in terms of texture and flavor and scent and that sort of thing. So, you know, even as you ease into it, don't feel like you have to always make everything from scratch. I mean, you can, sometimes we let perfection get in the way of possibility. And there are really good products available commercially now too. So I think doing a blend is not always such a bad thing. But always remind yourself and your clients that they're, especially when related to fermented foods, there's a transition phase. And I always tell people that there's a reason that sauerkraut tastes the way it does and that kimchi tastes the way it does. These are foods that by design, we don't really want to eat like a big bowl full of them. Just a small amount is all that's needed as a condiment. And you're going to be getting such a good spectrum of these beneficial bacteria. And I think the thing that I've loved so much about working this way with food is it's created this movement from the kitchen as a place of consumption to a place of creation. I mean, like, it never stops how creative you can be with these techniques. So that's really exciting. And on top of all that, though, you know, when we look at the different constitutions of people in Chinese medicine, I view people, you know, in the realm of 5 elements, but I also look at them in the realm of, you know, the Ayurvedic constitution differences. And there are going to be some people that even with working with fermented grains or fermented beans, you know, even when they're pre-digested, like we're talking about here, they might still not be the right thing for that person's constitution. And so you have to honor who you're working with and, you know, create the space for that too. And if this sounds like something that you'd like to learn more deeply, of course, I encourage you to, you know, any of these books down here is a great place to begin. And then, of course, I've got my program, funkykitchenfresh.com. And, you know, that's a great way to connect with me there. I have an ongoing Facebook group with that as well. And once you're in my group and you join me on Facebook, you know, that's an ongoing dialogue. It's a great place for me to help troubleshoot and answer questions. So there you go. And I thank you so much for taking the time to be with me today. And Paula, I don't know if we have any questions or comments or anything I can help with.
Oh, but we do. Dr. Sarica, this was just such a terrific, well-organized and researched presentation. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So a few things here. one of the first comments that came in on the, it was on your second slide,
Mm-hmm.
but all diseases begin in the gut, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, but the doctor's hands on the liver. It's like, well, it's kind of all related. That's when you get all the
It is.
right? I love it. You know, it's like people, students at Hawthorn are paying attention. It's like the liver.
I love it. Oh dear. I have to say, you know, I think sometimes our family is our hardest patient. You know, I try and not take care of my family too much as a practitioner. But my gosh, my daughter, her tummy was bugging her a couple of weeks ago, and I'm just trying to figure out, you know, like where and why. And you just step back and you say, well, there's so much that could be going on in any quadrant.
Yeah, that's right. All right, let's go on to the psychobiome.
Yeah.
Now that's a new term to me.
Isn't that nice?
It's really, really nice to consider the biome of our psyche.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Can we touch it?
Yes, we
Is
can.
it physical?
One of the nicest ways is to be touched nicely on our skin and someone stroke our hair. That's going to make us feel good. Yes, I know. Boy, that is something that I am so grateful that there's research. You know, Kelly Brogan is
Also, yeah.
Yeah, boy, she is down with this information. I love what she is sharing in relation to, of course, the impact of diet on the psychological experience.
Mm-hmm.
When I see the kind of stuff that's happening today, you know, with shootings and violence and whatnot, you know me, you know where I'm going. I'm going to the kitchen, and I'm trying to. I just want people to realize the impact of the crazy food that we're eating and how it's making people sick.
Yeah. Yeah, but you followed with a comment about forest bathing that Selhood had done research on also, and I'm familiar with her, but certainly forest bathing is, you know, something that I encourage and can attest to. I have the luxury and the blessing of being able to walk out my door at Hawthorn and walk into the forest, and often do to segue from a day into everything else that there is.
Yes,
so quite powerful.
Yes, I love that. I'm so glad you're familiar with her work too.
So then there's a question about water kefir. You said that you start it for everything.
I do.
Can you just explain briefly the difference what water kefir is versus any other kind of a kefir, and just your basic way to make it?
Yes. The reason I like it is it's easy to propagate. Once you get those little crystals that in that picture, you know, they look kind of like pink Himalayan salt chunks, but actually in actuality, they're soft. All it requires is water that doesn't have chlorine in it, because of course chlorine is going to knock out any beneficial bacteria. So it needs to be a non-chlorinated water with a decent mineral content, and then you just need sugar. And so it converts the sugar and creates a plentiful amount of lactobacilli. Now, again, my water kefir is going to be different than, you know, someone who took some of my water kefir grains a year ago and they're propagating in their own kitchen. And it's because we're using maybe different sugars, we're using, you know, different water sources. Our kitchens have different, you know, things happening in them.
Right.
But if you go to Cultures for Health, which is a great resource for getting into fermenting, making cheeses and stuff like that. If you go to Cultures for Health, they have a great page there that shows the basic components of water kefir. And so you can see what the general strains are that would be in there. And the reason I like it is it propagates quickly. It's not like I have to have it out for 6 weeks or something. You know, at room temperature, it will convert, you know, in a quart glass jar, it will convert maybe a quarter cup of sugar into a fermented beverage within about 36 to 48 hours. And so that's pretty fast. And then what I do is I use that as a culture starter for when I'm soaking grains, or when I'm soaking beans, or when I'm soaking, you know, nuts or seeds. That goes into the soaking water with a little bit of salt, and again, working with a good quality water. And it's my propagation. That's what I use. And And it's nice too, because if we want to, create a second ferment and make like a soda or something, using blueberries or raspberries or mango or something, you can create a soda with it. And so that's nice. But the other thing I like about it is that it doesn't have the things in there that a lot of people don't want, with kombucha. That's more acetic acids. It's way more in that kind of, kombucha I think is kind of peculiar. I think oftentimes it's too sweet and too sour at the same time. I think it's a very finite place when you finally get to the perfect like happening with kombucha.
I agree.
And it's got caffeine. A lot of people don't want that. And then a lot of other people will use like whey from yogurt. But if a person's really averse to working with any dairy, then that doesn't work. So that's why I like water kefir. Yeah.
So you're saying water, sugar, and the culture. So you need some kefir. You need some kind of kefir grains.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And you can get those again on Cultures for Health.
For me, I'm just reflecting back on all of this. And you get into your gluten-free slides or your gluten slides there, and talking about various things. And spring for me, I just had the great good fortune of growing up next to my maternal grandparents who were French and farmers, farming families, the deep farming families. And my grandfather always said that we were breaking winter's fast into spring with fresh dandelion greens, and then he would bring out all of his ferments. So the krauts and various things would come out, and certainly, his beer and wine that had been fermenting over the winter and things. It was a beautiful thing to hang out in his ferment cellar and just all the things that were bubbling. But that, that was just classic and something that I could count on. And now I'm finding this spring in particular that is almost every meal my body's insisting on ferment.
I love it. So good. Seriously, you're making my hair stand on end. This is so beautiful.
Well, I'm getting ahead of myself with a question that's further down, but one of the slides talked about 1 month of including fermented foods had yielded a variety of results, but didn't state, certainly haven't looked up the study, but how much ferment are you talking about? And when you say you just don't need a whole, a lot of it, you just need a condiment size. So let's talk fermentation.
That begs going back and looking, at the greater detail. Any study, if it's a good research study, it's going to reveal that. And, since I don't have it here in front of me, I'd have to, get into my computer and everything and find that of the exact amount for that quantity. But, if folks want, I can create a PDF of this presentation, and it will include, I haven't gotten to it, but 3 pages of like 4-point type resources. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, the PDF would be helpful. Thank you.
And you're welcome. And then, because, like with yogurt, I think that, with yogurt, we're going to eat, it feels right to eat more yogurt than it feels to eat sauerkraut. You know what I mean? For me, I can speak for myself. Sitting down to a cup of yogurt is no big deal in my book, but sitting down to a cup of sauerkraut would be like a job. I would not like how I felt.
Get it. I believe you. All right. So for the cultured dairy, there was, when it got to the part about the many benefits, it said it was a reduction in the risks leading to overall mortality. And that kind of got my attention. It's like, well, mortality is mortality. What's overall mortality?
I know. I thought that was an interesting way to say it too, and that's why I kind of emphasized that. It's I think looking at lifespan and how long somebody is living versus not living, and of course it's talking about the different ways that we can give up the ghost and the impact that can have. But the way I read that is it actually has to do with longevity.
All right. Then on your slide, there's a question about kefir in the milk section, in the dairy section. You were referring to any, not just cow dairy. You're talking about any kind of milk?
Yeah, and of course,
Milk alternatives as well?
well, the milk alternatives are interesting. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of milk alternatives. I think that to make something appear milky and palatable, there often needs to be gums and flavors that are, it's just a manufactured food. And so I'm not a huge fan of that, but if a person really wants to work with something like that, then what you would likely do is need to work with what we would call a direct set fermentation starter. And what that means is that you would only be able to use it like one time. So one of the things I love about creating yogurt at home is that it's a backslopping technique. I just maintain a little bit of what was from before or a mother culture. Yes. And then I just use that to start over again. But when you're doing a direct set with, like, let's say a coconut milk or something, you're going to need to add some sugar because it's going to need, in all likelihood, more sugar than what is natively going to be there. So really, you're going to be getting a lot of conversion on the sugar. But that is going to have impact on the macronutrient quality of the coconut milk as well. It's a tinkering. It's another kind of tinkering that you have to do because the inherent sugar content isn't going to be there. And also, a lot of these fake milks, alternative milks are, you can tell I do have a bias, I'm sorry, is that they're going to be using synthetic vitamins to increase the quality of them. Okay. And so that can maybe have some impact as well.
Okay, thank you. Maybe useful in some situations, but not in your kitchen.
Yeah, probably not. But you know what, I have to tell you, one thing that I have suggested people do is you can use water kefir, once again, superpower, use water kefir on like some, you could try that, a little bit of water kefir added to coconut milk and leave it on the counter for a day or two and see how that ferments for you. You just have to try it and see. Yep. And see what you think of it. Yeah.
Be willing to like it or not.
Or not. I remember when I first started doing this, I thought everything needed to be fermented. And I was so excited about it. And I remember fermenting goat's milk and using it as, I was using a kefir starter. And I was like, well, I'm going to just use it in my coffee. And it was horrible. Like, who would
Especially
do that?
In coffee. Right? Ruined a good thing.
I did.
Yeah, it was only once.
Right.
All right. So we're moving on to, I think you're in your veggie slide when this question came in. Well, can you briefly describe the difference between kraut and kimchi?
Yeah. So kraut tends to be made with like a green cabbage, maybe a purple cabbage, that kind of English European style cabbage, versus kimchi tends to be made with the Napa cabbage, usually some carrots, maybe some onion in there. And then there's often some fish stock that's added. And in my mind, that makes it taste really good. Yeah. I love that. It gives that more of an umami flavor profile. And then oftentimes, of course, they add some pepper, they might add some ginger, they might add some lemongrass. So it's a very different kind of nutrient profile.
Thank you. With grains, we're pretty much familiar with soaking and even sprouting a grain, but to ferment, then it would be as simple as adding like your water kefir to it for 24 hours or so before cooking?
Yeah, so today I just baked up a loaf of einkorn bread, and I mill the grain, we get it whole, and it's in a, no light gets through the bag, anything like that. And so anyways, really reducing oxidation by keeping it whole until right before we're ready to use it. And then I mill it. We have a nice grain mill from Germany. And then I add just some water kefir to it, add some sea salt, and again, some filtered water, mix it all up, and then I leave it, and then I'll stir it like once or twice. and over a 36-hour period at room temperature. And of course, what I start with at the beginning smells and looks and even sounds different than what I have at the very end when I'm getting ready to bake it. So for me, I like to go for about 36 hours. Of course, that's going to be impacted by the temperature in your kitchen. Yeah, so like, we live in Flagstaff. It's 7,000 feet. It's cold here in the winter. And so in the winter time, things take longer to ferment that way.
So any grain then, you're using corn in this case, but and then do you discard the water or do you cook with that?
Well, when I'm making it into a bread, that is when that I don't discard that because the liquid is incorporated into the flour, of course. When I'm like maybe soaking and fermenting rice, brown rice, before we make it, I do drain that off. And yep, and then I'll cook it like in some broth and some ghee, make it real tasty.
Yummy.
I know.
All right, what is next? The slide on lectins and anti-nutrients. You mentioned nightshades, but particularly potatoes too. Were those white potatoes or were you referencing sweet and yams as well?
No, it's white potatoes. It's those nightshades. So eggplant, falls into that category as well.
Right. It's like, you're talking about sweet potatoes too. I didn't think so, but we have to ask.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad you did.
But I had a comment about that. The statement on how the hard outer coating are designed by nature to cause digestive distress. I don't believe that. I don't think nature's that cruel that it intentionally designed something to cause digestive distress. It may cause digestive stress, but nature didn't intend it.
Exactly.
So,
no, I know. I mean, really. But it's a great way to get people to eat white rice.
So I guess. That's our goal.
Yes. I'm with you, though.
All right. Just one other comment of the big wow on the GABA increase in terms of benefits of soaking, sprouting, and everything. So, all right, here, lastly, from Andrea. She said, great presentation, Sarica. I was one of your Funky Kitchen Kit students. I've been successful with kimchi so far. I tried pickles last week and it didn't work out. I'm wondering if you could review the importance of temperature conditions during fermentation. I live in a humid climate. I think my conditions were perhaps too warm? Question mark. Pickles had an off flavor. I'll continue.
Yes, and Andrea, it's one of those times when you say bummer, but I'm grateful that it was just some cucumbers. I'm out. I mean, like we have to keep it in perspective and kind of, work with what we have there. But I think you're right. One of the big things that can really have quite an impact there is that high temperature. In fact, I even posted in our Facebook group a few weeks ago, someone had emailed me from India and he was wanting to work with making milk kefir, but it's like seriously like 120 degrees Fahrenheit where he lives. And I'm just thinking this is impossible just about to have the ability to ferment in, these environments. But to do what you can to keep it as cool as possible. And that's, even working with having just an ice box, an ice chest that you just switch out, just a couple, plastic bottles of frozen water, just to make it a little less hot in your space where you're doing that. And also maybe working with a little bit more salt than you had before. These are things that can make a difference. And the other thing also with the mushiness that sometimes people can have when they go to make these foods, adding a food that has a tannin component to it, so like a little bit of tea leaves or grape leaf, a shoshi leaf like they have in Japan, adding a little bit of that to the ferment as well can help with a crispness factor.
Okay, great. That's a really good base. So the temperature, is there a relative ideal temperature that we're trying to speak to?
I would say for veggies as just like a for a longer ferment, you know, something's going to be at least a month or so that it's going to be at this temperature. We want to have it probably in that no higher than about 65 degrees.
Okay.
You know, I mean, if you think about it, your grandparents' cellar was probably about 55 degrees.
Sure.
Yep. And a constant temperature, because what happens in a fermentation cycle is that it's an interesting, you know, it's kind of like cultures, like literally like human cultures, you know, over time, how the next one supersedes the one that came before. And this is what happens in the fermentation process as well. You have different species that rise up and then they subside and new species take their place. And having this kind of commonality in terms of temperature is a big part of allowing the proper species at the proper time to do what they need to do so that the next one can do what they need to do.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Okay. I think that brings us, I think that brings us to the end of the questions. Yeah, Andrea just wrote back. She says, really very helpful.
Oh,
Sure,
good.
her home environment temperature is mid to high 70s. So,
Ooh,
yeah. And so I notice that a lot when I'm doing pickles
yeah.
right out of the garden in you know, late summer, early fall, when it's crazy hot, to try to reduce that. So that is a really good tip for me. Thank you so much. I have just some closing comments. Everybody, appreciate just staying with me for another minute. And Dr. Sarica, I hate to put you on the spot like this, but I'm going to. I neglected to ask if you wanted to give a copy of your book to somebody in the audience.
Of course. No, I'd be happy to. You, however we decide that. You let me know.
Well, you know, there's going to be a survey, everybody, after the webinar closes, and let's just do it at that. You know, you put your name down, you fill out the survey, and you say, I want the book, because, you know, if you already have the book, I don't want to give you more. But, just let me know what you think of this and our webinars in general, and say anything you need to, and you'll be thrown in the mix for a copy of it. Okay? Thanks, Dr. Sarica. And a reminder that everybody, this was recorded and it'll be up on our website under archived webinars in just a few days. And a reminder, this back to back here, our next webinar on April 16th is with Dr. Liz Lipsky, and she's going to talk to us, I bet, on gut-brain autoimmune health, but we'll see here. And then tomorrow we have an All About alumni presentation at noon Pacific time with nutrition consultant grad Lori Fozo. She has put together such a beautiful presentation. I mean, it is power-packed with helpful hits and tips for how to get yourself in business and starting to succeed. So I sure hope that Dr. Sarica and I have inspired you here to learn some more about health and nutrition with all the webinars we've offered over the years and Dr. Sarica's over time. So if we have, please visit our website and check out the variety of nourishing programs and courses that we have to offer you. And I want to say thanks to James Bernardinelli for engineering and doing all the back end on these webinars. Thank you, James. And again to you, Dr. Sarica, it was just such a well-organized research presentation. I feel deeply enriched by it. So
thank you so much, Paula. I hope you all take good care.
I do too. Let's conclude this and thank everybody for sharing together this time, and I wish you all the best of health. And I sure look forward to learning more again here together in our webinars and our All About Alumni series on our Facebook and all those things. Hey, you know, it wouldn't hurt at all if you go to our Facebook page and like us. Everybody asks that. I never have before. So. All right, everybody, take care. I'm out.